Thank you very much, Neil, for an excellent talk. And now we're going to the last talk for our symposium, which is going to be given by Dr. Andy Kraplivi. Andy Kraplivi has been with Bell Labs since 1980, where he is currently Optical Technologies Vice President. He's responsible for a number of inventions that have greatly increased the capacity and speed of optical networks and are found in most high-capacity networks worldwide today. Among them is the non-zero dispersion fiber that is widely deployed in our networks. He's a member of the US National Academy of Engineering, a Marconi Fellow, and a Fellow for the IEEE and the OSA. Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, I never could understand why people clap before hearing a single word come out of the speaker's mouth. What if you're disappointed at the end of the talk? So thanks for that kind introduction. Thank you for letting me participate in this symposium. I'm going to begin the talk with a disclaimer. The assertions and viewpoints and opinions that you hear are strictly my own. They're based on being a casual observer of the passing scene for a long time in our industry. And I expect that some of the claims that I'll make will be outrageous enough that it might elicit some differing viewpoints. And certainly I hope it'll promote discussion beyond the confines of this symposium. I don't know why, but more and more I'm being told that one sign of imminent old age is that you talk more about the past than you do about the future. But in this case, I think it's important, especially for the younger members of the audience, to look backwards, to try to understand how we got where we are now. How did systems evolve, and why did they evolve exactly the way they did? And so for my first controversial claim, my claim is that we had to be where we are now because there was one and only one evolutionary path for optical communication systems in the long-haul networks. And I'll try to convince you of that in this talk. So I've decided to talk about the second era of transmission because it serves as a bridge from the first to the third, where we currently are. And if you understand what gave rise to the second era, and if you understand what now is slowly making it irrelevant, then you'll have a pretty good global view of the evolution and the history of optical fiber communications. The building you see in the background there is Crawford Hill. It's one of the smallest Bell Labs facilities. But its relevance to this talk is that much of the thinking in this talk was inspired and influenced by the work and ideas and concepts developed by these individuals. And most of them have spent at least part of their career at Crawford Hill. Now, these are very recognizable names in our business with accomplishments in many areas of fiber optic communication. But the common thread that ties them to this particular talk is their deep understanding of nonlinear effects in lightwave system and nonlinear systems in general. And here is my second controversial statement is, if you had to pick just one factor in the evolution of lightwave systems, I say that the most dominant factor in the evolution of systems is optical nonlinearities, and I'll prove it to you during this talk. So if we believe that optical nonlinearities played such a seminal role in the evolution of our systems, then this slide has to be shown. More for the benefit of the young people, you history buffs will recognize this person immediately. Roger Stolen is considered by almost everybody who does nonlinear fiber optics or any semblance of that as the father of nonlinear fiber optics. Because over 40 years ago, longer than most of you, before some of you were even born, Roger made the observation that someday optical nonlinearities might be a problem in optical systems. And so he set about methodically studying the physics of all the various nonlinearities and cataloging all of them. And then a lot of the work on systems-related nonlinearities benefited from the foundational work that Roger provided us. A second reason for talking about eras in lightwave communications is that it makes contact with Ecoc 6 years ago. I had the privilege of giving one of the plenary talks on the coming capacity crunch. And just for fun, in the conclusion slide, I slipped in a bullet point, again, to try to provoke the audience, that I said that I believed that we were entering the third era of optical communications in 2009. But it's easy to do because I get to define what I believe the closing of a particular era is, and on that basis, let me tell you what I believe the other eras might be. So the first era is started in 1977 with the first 45 megabit multimode systems by AT&T, and the first era is direct detection regenerated era, and lasted about 16 years. But already by the late 1980s, early 1990s, people knew that this era was coming to a close because the EDFA had been invented and was being perfected in laboratories around the world. And so this, the EDFA people said that this is the promise of massive WDM in a second era of communications. Unbeknownst to almost everybody is that the EDFA was a necessary but not sufficient condition to usher in the second era. There were surprises to come and inventions were required, and that's what this talk will be about. Now, the third era is the era, obviously, of coherent WDM. No one can argue with that now, I think. I think what is a surprise is how vigorously we adopted this era and how fast things have moved. And toward the end of the talk, again, I'll do a little bit of speculation, but it's not very, very profound speculation, because if you've been paying attention to what's been going on at conferences like this, you will not be surprised at all about what I'll have to say there. So this is an interesting chart with a glaring error. Those of you who were at Magnus Carlsen's lovely tutorial yesterday were chastised about our community in general misusing the word capacity. He says it's information throughput. And so this should be information throughput, and I would hate to be in Neil Brigano's shoes, because you know how many slides he's going to have to go back and change from capacity to information throughput? Anyway, so this slide has a lot of information despite the noisiness of it. For one thing, it's easy to squint and see that you have exponential growth as a function of time, about 60 dB of growth over about 30 years. The other thing to consider is that each one of these points at its time was some sort of world record or some major breakthrough or innovation or some new invention. And many of these were reported at post-deadline sessions at conferences like this. And if you understood the technology behind each one of these points, you would know everything there is to know about the history of lightwave communications. The third thing to note is that this slide is woefully out of date. It ends around 2007 or 2008. But it was this slide that I showed at the end of the talk and predicated my prediction on, and it was just based on these 4 points there. So it seems like it was a pretty flimsy evidence to make such a sweeping generalization about beginning and ends of era. But there were two things working in my favor. I have my particular definition of closing of eras, which I'll share with you later. But also these were special points, and you could see it a mile away. And that's because these experiments now employed advanced modulation formats, polarization, multiplexing, and coherent detection. So it wasn't such a stretch to say that we were on the cusp of something brand new. And I'll get back to this slide because, again, buried in there is some very significant information. But if nonlinear effects are what we're going to be talking about, let me just give you a brief primer on nonlinear effects. This slide is basically the culmination of Roger Stolin's work, where he neatly categorized the various nonlinearities into two types of stimulated scattering. Stimulated Brouillon scattering is a very low threshold single channel effect, but it's also one of the easiest nonlinearities to defeat, because all you have to do is artificially broaden the carrier spectrum and it goes away. A much more broadband stimulated effect is stimulated Raman scattering. This nonlinearity couples channels many terahertz separated, and the upshot is that if you have sufficient nonlinearity, it will start producing an apparent gain tilt, where the shortest channels have transferred powers to the longest channels. Fortunately, EDFAs were not perfect, and people had to invent gain equalization filters to take care of the gain non-flatness of EDFAs. And then once you have that device, you just factor in the stimulated Raman non-flatness and do it all with one device. The other broad class of nonlinearities is the Kerr nonlinearity, which is just a manifestation of the intensity-dependent refractive index. The more light the fiber sees, the higher its refractive index. And this leads to several different apparent effects. Cell phase modulation, where as pulse is propagating through the fiber, the edges of the pulses are at lower refractive index than the centers of the pulses. This produces phase shifts, time-dependent phase shifts of frequency broadening, and in chromatic dispersive limited systems, this could be a problem. Now, cross-phase modulation is a similar effect, but it's one WDM channel affecting another channel as the pulses collide, passing down the fiber. And the last per nonlinearity is 4-photon mixing, which is intermodulation distortion equivalent. So this was the neat picture that we arrived at 1992, 1993, very nicely compartmentalized. All the physics was perfectly understood. And this is sufficient for progressing in the rest of the talk. But again, I'm making claims about nonlinearities that I have to substantiate. So let me take 2 slides as an aside to show you that these nonlinearities are not static things. They're living, breathing monsters, and they've been evolving into much more complex forms. And the reason for that are twofold. First of all, EDFAs provide us ASE noise. And secondly, at higher bit rates, things change profoundly, because at 10 gigabits is the demarcation line between the simple nonlinear picture that you see here and the much more complicated picture that we now have to deal with in systems today. And by way of a cartoon, I'll show you that things change profoundly. This is a 40 gigabit RZ pulse stream. Nobody would launch this in a practical communication system, but it's just meant for effect. As you start propagating these pulses down a dispersive fiber, like a standard single mode fiber, they rapidly start broadening and neighboring pulses actually start overlapping. And this gets to be pretty bad. There's no sign of pulses left after only 6 kilometers of these fibers. And so now you can see what's happening here. You have neighboring pulses interfering with each other, trailing edges interfering with leading edges, and these pulses can be inducing nonlinearities within a single channel. You don't need WDM to see these new types of nonlinearities. This mode of propagation was dubbed as a pseudo-linear propagation mode by René Asselin. So now this simple picture goes away, and we needed somebody to, again, try to categorize these new effects along with the old effects. So the interchannel effects remain the same between signals. So you have cross-phase modulation and you have 4-photon mixing, just like before. But now we have noise, and noise can participate in nonlinear effects as well. So there's another sidebar there with signal and noise are interacting, and that's beyond the scope of this talk. But now you have this whole new class of nonlinearities, which is intra-channel. Nonlinearities because pulses are broadening and overlapping. And so again, you can see how much more complex the picture is today, but this will be useful in trying to convince you of something toward the end of the talk. So it was just a brief aside. Now we go back to the simple picture which we encountered in the early 90s, and the particular nonlinearity that the rest of the story is about is the 4-photon mixing nonlinearity. So I promised to come back here and try to make some sense out of this. If you concentrate on just one subset of these points, the blue triangles, the WDM points, the scatter magically vanishes and you get a very highly ordered picture here with a very little scatter, but with something very profound happening in 1993. There's 2 exponential growth patterns, but one is much, much higher than the other. After 1993, the growth of research experiments was 4 dB per year. And so what was it in 1993 that happened? Well, there were 2 things that happened. One was that the key breakthrough was not in systems, but actually in fibers. And the other, for the research end of it, to allow these massive WDM experiments to be made was an invention of a new laboratory technique. So here is the fiber and systems landscape in around 1992. There were 3 types of fiber: multimode fiber, which was not used for long-haul transmission; standard single-mode fiber, which blanketed the globe; and dispersion-shifted fiber, which was just coming on the scene. 2 points that set the boundary conditions for what happened is you have to understand that back in those days, there was no practical and there were no wideband dispersion compensations. And secondly, when major carriers heard about amplifiers and were asked how far apart should the regenerators be, they said that in the initial system, they would be satisfied with 400 or 500 kilometer regenerator spacings in amplified systems. So with these boundary conditions, let's take a look at some of the optical properties of the fibers that existed then. This is a standard single mode fiber where its lambda 0 due to material dispersion is at 1.3 microns, but at 1.55 microns where the minimum loss occurs, there's 17 picoseconds of dispersion per picosecond per nanometer. And what is the implication of that? Well, it's well known that to avoid chromatic dispersion penalties, you have to satisfy this inequality, where the product of the dispersion and the square of the bit rate in gigabits per second and the length in kilometers has to be less than 10 to the fifth. And so let's plug in some numbers, and for the example of standard fiber with 17 picoseconds of chromatic dispersion and a bit rate of 10 gigabits per second, the overall transmission distance was limited to 60 kilometers. And this inequality can be extended to arbitrary bit rates. It looks like this. So remember, back then, the commercial systems ran at 2.5 gigabits per second, and the reach in standard single fiber was approaching 1,000 kilometers, well in excess of the 400 or 500 kilometer target distance. But 10 gigabit systems were around the corner. They were going to come around in the mid-90s, and as I said on the previous slide, they're limited to very short reach. So this short reach at 10 gigabits was anticipated already in the 1980s, and people had been developing a new type of fiber called dispersion-shifted fiber, where by fiddling with the interface between the core and the cladding of the fiber, you could introduce what was called waveguide dispersion, which would push the overall chromatic dispersion curve so that the zero of chromatic dispersion coincided with the minimum loss wavelength. And that fiber, for example, a fiber with 1/10 of a picosecond per nanometer kilometer at 10 gigabits per second, that was almost semi-infinite long transmission distance. And so everybody declared victory and started laying this fiber. All of Japan was wired with this fiber, and some of the major carriers in the United States, like the MCI, put in major dispersion-shifted fiber builds, and this turned out to be a disastrous mistake. The one company that did not put fiber in, dispersion fiber in, was AT&T, and that's because they knew what was happening in terms of nonlinearities and new types of fiber development. So now we get to 4-photon mixing, where if you put in two signals into a fiber, there's an sinusoidally varying intensity at the beat frequency between these two, and that sinusoidal intensity fluctuation produces phase modulation sidebands. So for 2 channels, you'll get 2 of these phase modulation sidebands. For 3 channels, you get 9. And for a large n number of channels, you'll get something approaching n cubed over 2. So for by now a modest system, 32 channels would potentially produce 16,000 mixing products. And so you can see the problem here. First of all, the light in those mixing products comes from somewhere, and that somewhere is the signals. So the signals are going to be badly depleted. But the more insidious penalty paid for this is when you go to nominally evenly spaced channels, which all WDM systems were envisioned to be, then all of those mixing products that you see there, they move over to exactly lie on top of the signals. And so you start getting coherent interference between the mixing products and the signals. And in coherent interference, you know that a 1% signal is 10% in field, and when you square that, that gives you a 20% intensity effect. And this was very clearly seen in a experiment like this. Note that this is a very short 25-kilometer dispersion-shifted fiber, so not a lot of nonlinearities, very modest powers. These were 4 signals sent in there, and the formula predicts that there's 24 mixing products, and you can count them all up. And you can see that the largest mixing products are about 20 dB down from the signals. And when we make these channels equally spaced, those 20 dB down mixing products hit the signals right on top of them. And as I said before, this should produce a 20% effect on the eye, and there it is. This is not Gaussian noise. This is just the sampled sine wave where the relative phase of the signal and the mixing products are drifting up and down, and so your eye is opening and closing, but this is not something you want to have in your systems. Fortunately, at Bell Labs, some understanding of nonlinearities, but also a very deep understanding in fiber manufacture process, people realized that just by changing the production parameters of optical fibers a little bit, you could shift the dispersion of dispersion-shifted fiber by 20 or 30 nanometers. And the effect of this was to have about 2 picoseconds of dispersion at the operating wavelength. And again, understanding nonlinearities, you would then understand what magic this would have. And that fiber was brand named a True-Wave fiber. This is now part of the NZDF standard. But you can see just by bleeding in a little bit of this optical chromatic dispersion, you can get rid of the nonlinearity almost completely. And this introduced a new concept in the fiber business that's been around since then, the concept of premium fiber, because this view graph was one of the best marketing tools ever. when a carrier was about to install new fiber, the AT&T fiber people would put this view graph on the guy's desk who's making the decision and says, do you want this fiber or do you want that fiber? And the guy said, well, obviously I want that fiber. And he says, yeah, but that fiber is a lot more expensive. But if you really believed in WDM, they bought the more expensive fiber. And so this concept of making fibers do something that normal fibers don't do is this concept of premium fiber. And the fiber manufacturers are always looking for the next premium fiber. So it seems that the problem was solved. Well, the problem at hand was solved. We were able to overcome the issues of chromatic dispersion for 10 gigabit systems and optical nonlinearities that were present in dispersion-shifted fiber. But again, people had vision and they knew that 10 gigabits was just the next system, but the system after that was going to be 40 gigabits, and the timetable said that those systems are going to be around around the year 2000. So higher bit rates, what are the impact of higher bit rates? And also longer distances. People were going to eventually want to go under the ocean, and they would eventually want to go across the continent. And in that case, even this brand new fiber that caused all this excitement, this true-wave fiber, would have chromatic dispersion issues. And that's easily summarized by putting a true-wave fiber curve onto this this plot. And as you see, the problem at 10 gigabits was solved. At 10 gigabits, you could get the expected 500 kilometer reach. But at 40 gigabits, it had the same problem that standard single mode fiber had at 10 gigabits. You could only go 50 kilometers. So shortly after this, there was an even more important breakthrough in understanding than the fiber itself, was that, well, if we can move that dispersion zero in one direction, we can move it in the other direction. And so now you have two flavors of the true-wave fiber, with positive dispersion and negative dispersion. And this was the key breakthrough that's going to define the second era. And that's the fact that you could intermix fibers with opposite signs of dispersion. And so locally, there was always enough dispersion to kill off the nonlinearities, but globally, you would always return to zero at your receiver and eliminate all your chromatic dispersion penalties. So this is the example of the second experiment in dispersion management. This was an 8-channel experiment at 20 gigabits per second, and the overall length was 300 kilometers. So back in those days, those were unheard of distances for 20 gigabits per second. And we were able to defeat the nonlinearities, but also the dispersion problems that 20 gigabits per second would have in a conventional fiber. The second key contribution in 1993 was what is called the single modulator trick. If you're trying to scale your experiments to do massive WDM experiments with 10, 20, 30, 40 channels, you could not do that by duplicating transmitters and bit array test sets for all your channels. The bit array test sets in those days were $300,000 or $400,000 in 1993 dollars. And so the single modulator trick did the following. They used one bit array test set, one modulator, transmitted all the wavelengths through that single modulator, and then separated those wavelengths and dispersed them in time optically, and then recombine them, so that once the bit patterns of the various wavelengths were offset from each other, the bit array test set interpreted those as decorrelated bit streams. And so this single modulator trick has been used since to this day. Today it actually has a slightly different flavor. They use typically two modulators, one for even channels and one for odd channels, but the concept is the same. So without the single modulator trick, at least in the labs, it would be prohibitively expensive to try to do many channel experiments. And this dispersion management and NZDF really caught on, and other fiber manufacturers started making this fiber. eLeaf is a Corning rendition of this. Terralite was an Alcatel-Lucent, and then for Raman pump systems, different flavors of these NZDF were developed to, again, avoid certain types of nonlinearities between pumps and signals. And as I pointed out, the true-wave fiber became part of the NZDF standard G.6655. But shortly after all of this happened, another very important breakthrough was made, and that is the breakthrough of dispersion compensating fiber. Dispersion compensating fiber had very large negative dispersion, and so now you could do dispersion management without having different fibers in the field concatenated under the ground, but you could take high dispersion fiber and wrap it around a coil in your amplifier site, and then use one type of fiber out in the field. The problem with dispersion compensating fibers to this day is that they typically have very small core areas, and they themselves are susceptible to optical nonlinearities. Another breakthrough in the family of dispersion compensating fibers was making fibers with negative dispersion slope. And what this allowed you to do is to compensate over very broad bands. Remember, the two flavors of NZDF both had the same slope of dispersion, so eventually that dispersion map would start separating at the endpoints, and the outside channels would start having some residual dispersion at the end of the fiber. But with a large negative dispersion slope, you could compensate both first and second order dispersion. And this is what allowed dispersion compensation across, for example, the entire C-band. So the power of dispersion management became apparent, and the dispersion management became a cottage industry unto itself, because people realized that the engineering rules of a system were primarily determined to first order by how good a map you can design. And so many new innovations in dispersion management came about. The first one was dispersion pre-compensation. And this was stumbled on by trial and error in a lab, and I can tell you offline the anecdotal story of that. But that proved to be a very powerful technique going forward. The concept of residual dispersion per span, post-compensation, net residual dispersion, all these innovations made these dispersion management dispersion maps more powerful tools to combat optical nonlinearities. And dispersion maps took on many flavors. The singly periodic map was good for point-to-point systems, but then when you were starting to do optical networking, you would like to have controlled dispersion at each one of your nodes. And so this brought on the concept of double periodic maps. And in most cases, the fiber spans are of unequal length out in the field. So you get the things called transmission, you get aperiodic dispersion maps. And you think that this is over, but actually there's breakthroughs in this area of optical communications, and another one will be coming out shortly, so keep your eyes peeled for that. So let's recap. The second era, I contend, by my definition, and I'll eventually get around to telling you what it is that the dispersion management was the driving technology behind the second era. And the reason I'm not including optical amplifiers is because optical amplifiers were even more important, and they're going to be in all the future generations of optical systems. And so by themselves, they're not going to define individual technological eras. But I'm not taking anything away with that. None of this would have had to happen if optical amplifiers didn't come on the scene. So the key inventions happened in 1993. This was the non-zero dispersion fiber. These are now ubiquitous in undersea systems and widely deployed, at least in the North America terrestrial systems. Dispersion management was perhaps an even more important contribution than the fiber itself. And dispersion management now is perforce used to combat various manifestations of the Kerr nonlinearity. And as I pointed out, this is an industry unto itself, a very rich universe of mapping techniques. No less of an important innovation was this negative slope DCF, which allowed broadband dispersion management. And the reason I said that there was one and only one evolutionary path is that for almost 2 decades, this was the only way of transmitting large amounts of information through long distances. If there was multiple evolutionary paths, we would have seen them and they would have died out, and that would have been a survivor of the fittest. But there was no other idea to combat nonlinearities and chromatic dispersion. And so that was to substantiate my claim that there was only one evolutionary path. And had we not found that, we would have been mired in the bad old days of transmitting just several channels through optical fibers. So the big change in 2009 is that coherent systems came on the scene, and this is how I'm defining the end of the era, is that when a new technology comes in and can supplant completely the previous technology, regardless of the cost, it could be infinitely expensive, but when a new technology comes along that can do everything the previous technology did and more, that defines the end of the previous era. And so, again, a different way of saying it is if the old technology is no longer the unique solution, then that era is being phased out. So to summarize the 3 major technological eras, and I'm just going over this again to prove another point that I made earlier, 1977 to 93 was the era of direct detection and regenerated systems. Dispersion managed WDM was the next era, and you know curiously, both of those eras, at least by the way I've defined it, were 16 years long. The third era, which we find ourselves in now, is the conventional coherent WDM era, and it's hard to believe that this era is going to be able to make it to 2025. And again, why is that? Well, I made this comment about nonlinearities always lurking in the background, and of course everybody is aware of the nonlinear Shannon limit, and where does that come from? Well, it's once again nonlinearities coming into play and changing how you have to communicate through optical fibers. So the fourth era is not much speculation at all. It's spatial multiplex coherent WDM. When you run out of spectral efficiency due to the nonlinear Shannon limit, you have to do something different. But I'm not talking about simply lighting in parallel fibers. I'm talking about parallel paths through single strands of glass, but more importantly, transmitting spatial superchannels, which then you could do through parallel fibers. So in the United States, we say that there are two certainties in life, and that is death and taxes. But in our line of business, there's a third certainty, and that is that nonlinearities will always be with us and will always continue to shape system design. So if you didn't like this talk, I don't want to hear about it. Take your complaints to the people who inspired it. Thank you very much.